Hello and welcome to the 18th installment of the 50 Pages a Day War and Peace Quarantine Edition read through, covering pages 850 to 900. I am Matthew Robinson, and with me is Dimitri Portnoy in a lovely hue of green. Hello, Dimitri.
Hello, Matt. Hello, everybody. I am the Wizard of Oz today.
Yes, because of the Emerald City. Yeah,
Exactly.
great. Let's talk about this. We are 75% of the way through the book. We are
Yes.
3/4 of the way done. We are almost done. We've got, I think, 5-6 days left of this. It's not too bad.
I do have a critique of Tolstoy.
Ooh.
It's very seldom that the writer introduces the true hero of the novel 3/4 of the way through. We finally meet Count Rostopchin, Moscow's commander in
Oh, geez,
chief,
yeah.
who uses posters in crude and debased language to rouse the populace. He sees it as his duty to guide the feelings of the people who
Mm-hmm.
are under him, of the citizens, to hate the French and to love himself. He refuses to move the stockpiles of bullets and grain and weaponry and tools in order to create in his peoples the false impression that nothing is wrong, everything is fine, and no one's moving towards Moscow. Certainly not the French virus.
It's
Napoleon.
almost as if he were calling the French invasion of Moscow a hoax.
Yes, exactly. And
But
it's it.
he wasn't talking about the French invasion. He wasn't calling them a hoax. He was calling the Russian people who are always trying to undermine him. It's their hoax, obviously.
Of course. And he found, again, as the hero of War and Peace, he found the true villain of everything, the captain of a ship. I'm sorry. Who was it again? Oh yes, a lawyer
Yeah,
who worked for the
a
government,
traitor.
who a traitor. Yes. Again, I'm so happy that this novel talks about what happened 200 years
Yeah,
ago, which couldn't
no
possibly
modern
have
parables.
any relevance to us. We can just look at this history and
Yeah.
laugh, knowing that no one in their right mind would possibly repeat it.
Yeah. So we are obviously talking about the sacking of Rome today. I mean Moscow, the burning of the wooden city, a famous historical event where all of Moscow, the capital of Russia and one of the largest cities in the world, was completely abandoned and set afire. We open on, of course, meeting Count Rostopchin, who is the only governor of this place, basically saying, "Don't abandon it.
Yeah, the commander in chief,
Yeah,
of Moscow.
don't abandon.
I mean, quite literally.
Stay. Everything's going to be okay." And because of his delay, it caused a lot of trauma. A lot of people left at the same time, leading to looting and violence and confusion. The police didn't listen to him and abandoned Moscow, leaving it open to anarchy and mayhem as which happens. And so we start out seeing this through the Rostovs, who decide, regardless of what the commander in chief says, that they are going to leave, but they're choosing to leave the day before the French arrive. They probably should have left about a week earlier. And they're trying to pack up everything they own of value. And Natasha is a Tetris master at packing things and
Hmm.
perfectly gets everything into the crates. But at the same time, her moral fortitude is showing as the injured troops pass by, and she says, "Please use our soon-to-be empty home to rest." And in the dead of night, a soldier is snuck in and takes refuge in their home, and we find out that it is Prince Andre. He's not dead. He rises from the grave.
What a shocker.
He rises from the grave just before Easter, as we're reading this for the second time. Nobody knows he's there yet other than Sophia. They don't want to tell Natasha because it would be too intense for her. And so they stow him in the lead carriage as they're leaving Moscow. But before they leave Moscow, Berg, husband of Vera, shows up. And showing us the opposite of moral fortitude, wants to borrow a cart so he can steal some furniture for his abandoned house.
Well, not steal it, but actually, like, take something that was given to him as a gift.
Yeah, I don't
A
think
little
that's I don't
dresser
think
with a
that's
secret
accurate.
compartment. It's so cute and
Yeah, I
beautiful.
don't think anyone gave that to him. I think he's stealing it. And yeah, Natasha's father, the Count Rostov, throws up his hands, upset with this man. And then when Natasha comes to him and says, "Father, what if we didn't take all our valuables and instead used that cart space to get these wounded soldiers out of her?" And her father, having just come off of hearing Berg's moral ineptitude, is moved by the emotion of doing something positive and worthwhile and says, "Yes, leave all the crap, leave all our, hundreds, like 300,000 rubles worth of stuff," he says, "and we'll take as many troops as we can with us." Little does Natasha know that in the front carriage, leading the way out of Moscow, is the love of her life, Prince Andrei.
If you did not love Natasha
Yeah.
yet, and if you didn't, what's wrong with
Yes.
you?
She is the
This
heroine of the novel.
self-sacrifice. Because she's basically giving away her dowry.
That's right.
She's giving away her inheritance, the chattel. They don't know if the real estate. They don't know if the house is going to be there. It's going to burn. They don't know if the French aren't going to take the land and if they're ever going to leave. Their only riches are in these things. And instead of taking these things that are her only possessions, her only dowry potentially for later, her only way of living later, she takes wounded soldiers. This is a huge self-sacrificing act.
It's a real full circle for her.
Well, the first time we see her, she gets a pair of ruby earrings from the Countess. The Princess Maria Dmitrievna, and it's very interesting that it's like she's kind of passing things forward in this case, from someone who gets incredibly generous gifts to someone who gives everything she owns away to help others and to save lives, because those wounded soldiers are not going to get the best treatment when Napoleon shows up.
Not at all. And from there, we get Natasha and her family fleeing Moscow. And as they are fleeing, we serendipitously meet another one of our main characters as Pierre is walking the street dressed as a peasant in a kaftan, acting very suspicious and nervous. And Natasha thinks he's so brave for staying in Moscow. And we're confused as readers because we don't know what he's doing there. Last we heard, he was just fleeing as he was told to do. And then we get sort of a Tarantino-esque flashback, which is an interesting bit of narrative work that Tolstoy does here. And then we jump to how Pierre got there on the street. And we find out that he was at an old friend's house, one of his benefactors, sorting through his papers, and comes up with the idea to assassinate Napoleon. Also a Tarantino-esque plot, it feels like. We're reminded of his strange mystic numerological connection to Napoleon, where he found himself to be equal the letters of 666, just like Napoleon, and he believes he is the only
Larousse.
Yes, he is the only one who can slay the beast, and so he asks the servant of his friend's house to help him go buy a pistol. And we learn that's where he was going when he was spotted by Natasha as he was nervously going to buy a pistol on the black market. And the
benefactor is actually the guy who initially conscripted him into the Masons.
Right. Yeah, so his guru, sort of.
Yes, and he's there. He initially came to that house to read,
right?
To look for the library of Masonic texts, those precious revelations written down in Scotland and imported into Moscow. And for a day, he tries to focus, and he can't make heads or tails out of them, which is what drives him towards a desperate act, which I don't think he succeeds, right? I mean, this isn't Tarantino's Inglorious
That's right.
Bastards,
Yeah.
right? This isn't about actually shooting Napoleon and changing all of history. That's not the Tarantino you're talking
Yeah.
about.
What's interesting, there's so many novels in this novel. I mean, you could take this massive tome and separate it out into about 5 or 6 really great, satisfying novels. You know, I mean, one of them would just be the story of Pierre in abandoned Moscow with the dreams of assassinating Napoleon. You know, I mean, there's just so many rich stories in this book that could easily take up 300 pages on their own, and sometimes do.
One of the things about this book that I keep emphasizing is how unlike its later imitators it is.
Yeah.
That the adaptation of this novel and the writers who are influenced by this novel have really regularized its oddness, have really regularized its uniqueness. When Tolstoy like says about Rostopchin, for example, that Rostopchin is someone who felt the kind of anger that comes when recollecting an offense or remembering an offense. And you go, that phrase, I know that anger.
Yeah.
That really hooked me. I know how angry I get when I'm suddenly reminded of a wrong or an injustice someone did me. That observation, uh, that tiny phrase, it is worth, like, I would have read 1,200 pages of this novel just for that one phrase. It's a huge novel built on tiny observations that are incredibly precise and accurate. It is a telescope and a microscope at the same time.
Someone like Jonathan Franzen does that really well. I mean, there's a lot of writers who are very clearly influenced by that exact type of that exact ambition as a writer.
Yes, but this novel does it well. Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Absolutely.
Ta-Nehisi Coates quotes Saul Bellow saying derisively, who is the Tolstoy of the Africans? And the response is, Tolstoy. Is it, who's your Tolstoy, Bellow? I mean, there is only one Tolstoy. And to really understand that, I actually had to read this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So we get one of my favorite moments in the whole book, which is Napoleon arriving to Moscow and his, I love anytime Tolstoy puts us in Napoleon's mind and his grand plans, this ridiculous fantasy he has that he's going to walk in and, the nobles of Russia, this antiquated government faction that doesn't even exist anymore, is going to welcome him, and he's going to make this impassioned speech, and they're going to freely hand over the city and realize that he is the savior of Moscow, and the city will flourish under him. And meanwhile, all of his adjutants are running around terrified because they can't decide who's going to be the one to tell them that the city's already been abandoned. And then Tolstoy.
What's interesting is, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
What's interesting is that you get a Monty Python moment where there are like 5 or 7 homeless people defending the Kremlin, and they manage to fire off a few shots before 3 cannons blast them. Yeah. 3 French cannons blast them into nothing. And again, it's absurdity and bitter humor
and intense
incredible irony and sarcasm. Who, Napoleon is greeted with a completely asymmetric enemy. He is kind of greeted by the last surviving members of Al Qaeda.
Sure. Yeah.
Or ISIS, like desperate, mad people who broke into a storehouse of weaponry and are now being blasted away by French professional soldiers with incredulous looks on their faces.
So Napoleon is devastated. We'll see more of Napoleon's devastation later. Um, Tolstoy has this beautiful piece where he describes a deserted beehive, comparing it to Moscow, and it's a lovely bit of writing. Then we go back to Rostopchin, and we see the rioting in Moscow, and a mob forms outside of his palace, and a mob of people who stayed, listened to him, the few remaining people who liked him, the diehard right wingers, and they show up and they go, "Yeah, let's fight the French." And Rostopchin realizes that it won't be long before they want to kill him, because fighting the French is going to be a bad plan, and he was wrong, and he knows eventually they're all going to realize he was wrong, and he will end up the source of their anger. And so instead, he says, "Free all the prisoners, but go grab me one of those poor people that we decided were traitors, and I'm going to throw them to the rabble, and they'll murder him, and meanwhile I'll escape out the back door." And it doesn't quite go as planned. The crowd tries to kill this guy. They don't even do it. It's a lot of confusion. Rostopchin escapes, and on his way out, he sees the literal insane madmen from the insane asylum that he commanded to leave, and the city is just full of madmen. And he even sees the grizzled, bloody form of the traitor walking through the streets, and he says it's something that he'll never be able to shake from his memory, this vision of this half-dead man, that he is to blame for his death. And he becomes sort of a metaphor for the city that and all the deaths that were caused by his idiotic plan.
And then Tolstoy tells you that the city burnt down not because anybody deliberately set fire to it, but because the houses are made out of wood, and there are 135 badly functioning water pumps. And when you have soldiers cooking kasha or roasting something over the fire, it's going to set alight. It's like all this senseless destruction. Not senseless, because ultimately it does win the war for the Russians, and it does destroy Napoleon's army. Was unplanned. Or something anyone could have predicted. Like, for example, if you don't have a stay-at-home order when you have a highly contagious virus. Not that there's anything parallel to it, but if you keep the beaches open in Florida during spring break, when you have a lot of older people who are susceptible to, but again, I'm not saying anything. I'm not drawing any parallels.
So Tolstoy tells us how the French army lost, basically, which was that they entered as an army and they left as looters, and that the wealth of Moscow and the greed was almost too much for the French troops, who all just separated once they hit the city and all tried to take as much valuable stuff as they could with them and get out of there. And so it was sort of their greed that was a huge part of the death of the French army. So Tolstoy says, in terms of the burning of Moscow, the Russians like to look back at it and say that they burned it on purpose, and it's this badge of pride that Russians wear even to today, that they're willing to burn their own city rather than lose it. And the French wanted to believe that, they burned it. But yeah, like you said, the truth was it's a wooden city, and when everybody leaves, nobody's there to put out the small fires, so they become big fires, and then the city's gone. Which feels like something Tolstoy is often dancing around, of just this lack of, one individual having any real consequence, and that it's just chaos and so many different factors, and so it's everything is always so complicated and bigger than any one person's decisions. And
I think we've covered pretty much all the horrible destruction and death.
Now we just go to Natasha and Andrei's wedding, and that's it. That's the book.
Yes, and Pierre's reconciliation with Hélène.
That's it.
Who basically begs forgiveness for all the traitorous, all the ways in which he betrayed him. Have we left
No.
anything out? Oh yes, everybody comes
Yeah,
back to life.
Anatole is
All the dead
there.
people.
It's all going to be fine. Uh,
Anatoly has three
Three.
legs now to make up for losing one.
All right, so that is it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with pages 900 to 950. Enjoy your reading. You're almost there. It would be ridiculous to stop now. We will all be at the finish line together.
Such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure, even when it does churn
Yeah,
my
it's
gut.
a gut churning section for sure. Goodbye, everybody. See you tomorrow.